for trees. In this learning block, we will consider two house typologies, the kominka or minka in Japan and the hanok in Korea, which evolved using wooden structural elements with specific details. The Japanese word kominka literally means old house, and the term, also called minka, usually refers to houses built no later than the Second World War. It has a history of several centuries in Japan, and it also usually refers to houses built using traditional Japanese architectural methods, often without using any nails and choosing the type of wood depending on its use. It was a house for farmers and city dwellers, but not the aristocracy.
One of the supplementary videos for this week shows the timber framing construction methods for the Japanese house.
The devastation wrought during the period of the warring dynasties between 475 and 221 BCE forced people to abandon houses that couldn't be defended, and for merchants, farmers and artisans realized that they needed more solid houses that could protect them. Enter the minka. This was a house type that was fitted out to have a longer life, be robust and fire resistant by having an outer layer of plaster with many layers to protect the timber skeleton in the case of fire.
So just note the combined construction method. We have timber frame, then probably some type of timber lats with plaster over the top.
These houses were more complex and required skilled carpenters to make them, called daiku. Minka were required to have a robust structural framework. In Japan, typhoons, thick snow, high winds, and earthquakes meant that this was a typology that should be both flexible and highly tensile, an elastic building technology that meant stone was out of the question, and where timber beams with complex no-nail joints were necessary. In the east of Japan, severe cold was experienced in the winter months, and minkas here had a fireplace built into the ground with a compacted clay floor, with straw and rice husks spread in winter for extra insulation. By contrast, in the western part of Japan, timber floors were used. In Kobe, the Hakogi Senanya, a house that is purportedly 1,000 years old, has half of the footprint with wooden floorboards. Timber was rare in this period, and therefore valuable and expensive. Interestingly, the guest area of the house uses boardwood flooring with large, wide planks, whereas the area for the inhabitants is covered with closely placed bamboo rods. This might demonstrate how guests were appreciated. Later, by the 15th century, boarded floors would begin to be replaced by softer tatami mats. This meant that the minka had three distinct sections: the doma, work area, the living area with wooden floorboards, and the guest area with tatami laid out on the floor. In the west of Japan, rice cultivation began during the Kofun period between 300 and 700 CE. This led to the installation of a separate fireplace for cooking in the work area, away from the living area. The biggest challenge for building technology in Japan is the humidity during the rainy season. To survive the seasons without damage, they had to be as ventilated as possible. This is why they were raised off the ground. Sliding room dividers inside the house meant that the living space was flexible when people had to spend long periods at home. Other aspects of the construction prioritized the characteristics of timber. For example, the most vulnerable part of a piece of wood is the end grain, when it is heavily exposed to moisture and cannot dry out. The most effective way to deal with it, then, is to construct joints in such a way as they are completely concealed. This means that two pieces of timber have to be jointed in line, butt jointed, with the functional part of the joint being on the inside of the timber.
Adjust voice so you can see the details of the construction. So it's all constructed without nails, it's all timber joining techniques. And the way that the timber is joined is optimizing the natural strength characteristics of the timber and also the parts of the timber that will rot quickest, like the exposed end grain. So the cutting across the tree trunk, that's the part that will rot first. So you don't want that exposed to the weather. So this joining method is working with what the timber already naturally wants to do.
Over time, the veranda gained more importance in Minka architecture. In the west, sliding doors were introduced to bring the inhabitants closer to the surrounding nature. In the colder east, folding shutters and horizontal boards were used. The spacious extension of floor and ceiling beyond the interior created a place for receiving guests, and the modular components that mediated the relationship to the surrounding nature meant that the veranda created a soft boundary between interior and exterior. Though this might seem to be a simple touch, it would have been a challenging task for a carpenter of the time, considering the tools available. 2 sliding doors and a paper-covered door required 3 parallel grooves in the threshold beam and the lintel beam above it. The Minka in Japan developed in relation to the needs of the people and specific local conditions relating to topography, climate, and economy meant that a wide variety of variations on the general layout of the Minka exist. Historical events also affected these changes. As society transitioned from an era of war to a peaceful society, the architectural historian Klaus Werger notes that an exclusive aristocratic culture that was opposed to change virtually forced the development of a citizens' culture. Under these conditions, the Minka developed into an architectural expression of social change. Its design became one of the main pillars of artisan activity, which found its expression in more and more refined details, as well as in cleverly hidden transgressions of class-specific building limitations. Carpenters, Daiku, developed incredible skill and knowledge of the development of construction details that made it easier to replace building.
It's a bit hard to see with the trees behind. So this is the social context of the architecture, why the architecture developed the way it did. And also, if you haven't noted down the name for carpenters, the Daiku.
Daiku developed incredible skill and knowledge in the development of construction details that made it easier to replace building elements when required at a later date. Extreme seasonal change is one thing that Korea shares with Japan, and the hanok, the traditional form of house architecture, is a case in point in comparing and contrasting how a building tradition with timber responds to those conditions. Traditional hanoks originated prior to the Joseon dynasty that began in 1392. In Korea, northerly areas with their cold winters meant that underfloor heating was created, providing heat to closed rooms called bang. By contrast, the southern provinces with hot summers.
When was the last time we heard about heated floors? We've already talked about heated floors. Which other culture was using heated floors?
Roman spa.
Yes, correct. The Romans were also using heated floors. So nice, right? Cold weather, heated floor.
Maru were developed, a wooden floor with ventilation beneath and open daejeon sewing rooms.
So there's 2 main types. We have the cold weather house and the warm weather house. So they have slightly different adaptations to how they're placed on the site. Yep. So the cold weather, they have the heated floor that the bang. And then the warm weather have summer rooms.
As with hot summers, maru were developed, a wooden floor.
Under the daito, which I can't say properly. So these are adaptations to the climate of different parts of Korea.
Ventilation beneath and open daejeon summer rooms. The teaching of Pongsu in the West, known as Feng Shui, relies on the observations of nature and has a major influence on the design of cities and buildings. According to these teachings, in ancient Korea, buildings faced south wherever possible, with very few access from the north. The courtyard, Madang.
Did you get the spelling of that? Okay. This is Pongsu instead of Feng Shui.
The courtyard, Madang, are the centerpiece of traditional Korean architecture.
Sorry, too fast. Madang, which is the courtyard.
And with the hanok, the space is subdivided into a series of transition zones between the public entry of the courtyard to the private spaces of the home. Traditionally,
I'll just pause here so you can see the floor plan with the courtyard and how the rooms are distributed around the courtyard. I'll also point out that one of the supplementary videos for this week, there is a Japanese house, the House of Sugimoto. That one has also got layers of public and private space. So have a look at that supplementary video, that one's on YouTube, and have a look at how the spaces are organized as well.
Provides a space for household duties to happen out in the open, such as the pickling of vegetables for winter and the making of kimchi. The skeleton of timber in the hanok is created with posts and beams of pine trees, Pinus densiflora, and are usually single-story only. The timber elements are joined using precisely fitting carpenter joints with wedges, meaning that they are push-fit joints to resist bending. In this way, freestanding pavilions can be made without bracing walls. Foundation stones rest on a raised platform with peripheral walls made of natural stone. One of the main characteristics of the hanok is the ondol.
I just pause so you can see the diagram of the heated floor. So the spelling is ONDOL.
Floor heating system, which can be compared to the hypercaust system of the Romans. Furnaces are located in the lower plinth area, and the system is also connected to fireplaces in the kitchen. From these, ducts run through the plinth area beneath the rooms to be heated. Beneath the rooms, the ducts are covered with stone slabs, which in turn are covered with a layer of clay. This is also the origin of the name Ondo, which literally means warm stone.
Okay, now we have one more. Okay, so this is a for next week that I'm playing this week, just to help the reading presentations groups, because this gives context to the Marc-Antoine Laugier reading. So those groups who are doing their reading presentations, take note of this one.
Capitalism. Sorry, socialism. Sorry. RC class. Yeah, I was like studying this. Yeah, it was crazy.
In this learning block, I want us to think about the European cultural idea of nature. We haven't looked at Europe in that much detail yet in this course, and because the next learning block will be looking.
If you just want to note down the author's name, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. It's fairly important in European history at this time. Yeah. Rousseau. Everything's in French, so don't try and read it. Unless you can read French. Just write down his name, Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Log house. I want us for a moment to think about theoretical discussions happening in Europe in a little bit of a later time frame, the 17th and 18th centuries, and to think about how architecture was managed as a cultural idea. The theorist, Eyal Weizman, I think describes this really well. He says, throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, the period when the conceptual framework of the state of nature was reshaping moral, legal, and political philosophy, European forests were being taken down at the fastest rate to date. The great forests largely turned into cropland and fuel prior to wood's replacement with coal as Europe's main source of energy. The colonial economy's appetite for ships finished off the rest, with merchant ships and gunboats requiring 4,000 to 6,000 oak trees, several hectares of forest each. Abraham Boss's etching for the 1651 frontispiece of Tom.
So this is a slightly later time frame than our course, but there's a lot of formative ideas in this time frame that are related to things that are happening before. Okay? So this is a sort of philosophical context in which people are thinking about designing cities and making buildings. So if you think of the example that it takes 4,000 to 6,000 oak trees to build one of these big European ships, imagine how many European ships were in sail during the Great Age of Exploration. Yeah? Which explains why there's not a lot of forest left in Europe at this point in time now.
Leviathan depicts this figure of the sovereign rising over deforested hills. It's not a coincidence. In the European imagination at the time, the forest line still marked the limit of sovereignty, the areas of productive economy, and thus also the threshold of the law.
So this is the front title page from a work called The Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes, who is an English philosopher. And what Dr. Davis is pointing out is the landscape in front. It's basically not a single tree.
Threshold of the law. Sovereignty could only rise over cultivated nature, that is, over a destroyed ecosystem. Accounts of these impenetrable forests reached 17th and 18th century Europe by colonial travelers, settlers, traders, and cartographers who had penetrated their dense biomass, their unbearable heat and disease. This second encounter with the forest provoked European philosophers to think about the origins of society.
So there's this formative idea about the relationship between the landscape and how the landscape is managed and how human society is managed. So there's a connection thought of between the two things. So when Europeans start to encounter wild, in inverted commas, landscapes or uncultivated landscapes, they come to them with a certain set of opinions about the people in those landscapes as well.
And human nature. From the perspective of these early moderns, the state of nature was no longer separated from civilization in time. That is, a condition prior to the foundation of society and legal order, but rather coincided with it in space. Existing beyond this shifting boundary was an extraterritorial space, conceived under the imperial and racist framework of terra nullius, which ignored the social structures and forms of ownership.
Okay, so the Latin term is terra nullius. And that basically means that this land is uninhabited because it's not cultivated. So that's how, for example, the British approached Australia. Yeah? So they thought of it as a blank canvas because it wasn't cultivated. Like they didn't see farms. They were obviously looking with the wrong eyes, but that's how they approached it.
Indigenous people and regarded them as part of the natural environment. There was an obsessive curiosity of the idea of a man in his natural state that would define how Europeans thought of the relationship between social customs and forms of dwelling to which they are tied. In the classic tale of Robinson Crusoe, Daniel Defoe turns a story of missionary exploration to practical account. Robinson Crusoe is a castaway, isolated and deprived of civilized comforts, struggling to subject nature to his needs in this 18th century bestseller. Daniel Defoe sought to correct the errors committed by savages and civil society alike. With his novel, we can really think about the relationship between architecture and the tree itself as a cultural emblem. Robinson Crusoe was an economic man, yet in his state, he is simply deprived of everything necessary for him to lead a civilized life. The line between savagery and humanity was tenuous and held more by moral determination than by forms of art. He spends his first night perched in a tree, and Crusoe quickly realizes that this is a very fragile way to live. He wonders, what kind of dwelling should I make? Whether I should make me a cave in the earth or a tent upon the earth. This is how we arrive at another 18th century classic text that brings us closer to this relationship between architecture and the tree as a cultural symbol.
So this one's the front page of Logier's essay on architecture. That would be what would be called in English. This is actually the second edition. This picture that you see here with the muse pointing to the origins of architecture wasn't in the first edition. This is added later on. And the image is significant because it explains a set of ideas in the text. So if you look at the picture there, we see a building which is kind of very literally made out of trees. Yeah. And we have this muse, the lady. She's kind of leaning on some ruins which look like they might be Greek or Roman, out of stone. And her back is turned to them. She's facing away from those Greco-Roman ruins, and she's pointing at the tree structure. And she's sort of indicating, no, this is the beginning of architecture. You look at the structure, it's very simple, right? You have 4 tree columns with a lintel across the top and the gable. And that basically summarizes most of Logier's essay on architecture.
It's by a priest called Marc-Antoine Logier, and he says, "It is with architecture as with all other arts. Its principles are founded upon simple nature, and in the proceedings of this are clearly shown the rules. Such is the step of simple nature. It is the imitation of her proceedings to which art owes its birth." When we look at this image of the so-called in the frontispiece, we can see that Loggia is talking about an imitation between the tree, the architecture. The tree is nature, and architecture imitates it.
Okay. So at this point, I think we'll take a short break. And then after the break, we'll talk about research. Okay, so we'll take a 10-minute break until 10 past 10. Yeah?
Oh no, that's my voice. Yeah.
And can I have,